My name is Alex, and I'm 38 years old. For most of my life, I've been the reliable one, the steady hand, the son my parents could count on, though never the one they celebrated. Last month, at a dinner meticulously planned to honor my younger brother's supposed success, my father raised a crystal glass of overpriced champagne, looked me dead in the eye, and publicly called me a failure. He didn't know that just a few feet away, obscured by a floral arrangement, the governor of our state was about to stand up, walk over to our table, and call me a hero. If you've ever felt like the invisible child in your own family, the one whose accomplishments are met with polite silence while your sibling's every move is celebrated with a parade, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Before I tell you how that single, humiliating toast backfired in the most spectacular and public way imaginable, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because this is a story about how true success is often built in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to step into the light. My story isn't one of sudden tragedy, but of a quiet, slow erosion of self-worth, a death by 1,000 paper cuts, orchestrated by the very people who were supposed to build me up. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Miller, are pillars of their community, or at least, that's the meticulously curated image they project. Richard is a retired financial consultant, a man who measures the world, and everyone in it, by their stock portfolios and return on investment. To him, a person's worth is a number on a balance sheet. Eleanor, my mother, is a former society columnist who never quite gave up the habit of judging everyone's life choices as if they were up for public review in her next article. Their lives are a performance, and they expect their children to be star players. And then there's my younger brother, Mark. He is, and always has been, their undisputed star player, their golden child. From the beginning, our paths diverged as if drawn on two separate maps. Mark was the charmer, the risk-taker, the one who could talk his way into and out of anything with a dazzling smile and a well-placed compliment. He floated through college on a gentleman's sea, his tuition and extravagant lifestyle funded entirely by my parents. He then embarked on a series of flashy-sounding startups, each one more disruptive than the last, and each requiring a fresh infusion of seed money from the bank of Dad. Each spectacular failure was expertly reframed by my parents as a valuable learning experience. Each reckless financial decision was lauded as proof of his bold entrepreneurial spirit. He wasn't failing, he was pivoting. I, on the other hand, was quiet, introverted, and studious. My passion wasn't for spreadsheets or social climbing. It was for history, for the silent stories held within the crumbling brick and decaying timber of old buildings. I found beauty in forgotten things. I became a historical preservation architect, a career choice my father once described at a family Christmas party as a noble but fundamentally unprofitable hobby. It didn't matter that I graduated magna cum laude, that I had paid for most of my own education through scholarships and part-time jobs, or that I was slowly building a reputation for my meticulous, passionate work. In their eyes, I had chosen passion over profit, history over the future, and in their world, that was the ultimate sin. The pattern of our family dynamic was set early and encased in concrete. I was the family's utility player, the emotional and, more often than not, financial backstop. When my parents' antique slate roof needed extensive repairs and their emergency fund was unfortunately tied up in a volatile market, I was the one who drained my hard-earned savings to pay the contractor. It was framed as a loan, but the repayment date never came. It was simply, and conveniently, forgotten. When Mark's second startup, an app for customized dog collars, collapsed spectacularly, leaving him with a mountain of debt and an eviction notice, it was my stable income and good credit that co-signed for his new luxury apartment lease, a risk that left me with sleepless nights for 2 long years. They didn't see it as me helping. They saw it as my duty. My quiet, steady success was meant to serve as the safety net for Mark's glorious, exciting failures. I remember one specific family vacation that perfectly encapsulates our roles. We went to Italy for 2 weeks when I was 25 and Mark was 21. I had spent months saving for my share, excited to see the Colosseum and the Uffizi Gallery. Mark showed up with a new designer wardrobe, paid for by my parents, and proceeded to treat the trip as his personal party tour. One night in Florence, he borrowed the rental car without permission and ended up getting it towed after parking in a restricted zone. The next morning, instead of facing the consequences, my father gave me €500 and the complex task of navigating the Italian bureaucracy to retrieve the car, while he and my mother took Mark shopping for leather jackets to cheer him up. I spent 8 hours of my vacation in a stuffy municipal office, while my brother got a new wardrobe. When I finally returned, exhausted and frustrated, my mother patted my arm and said, "Thank you for being so responsible, Alex. We can always count on you." It wasn't a compliment. It was a job description. This dynamic only intensified as we grew older. Family dinners were less about connection and more about performance, specifically Mark's performance. We'd be treated to endless monologues about his latest disruptive idea, the fancy restaurant he'd visited, or the influential person he'd supposedly charmed. My own achievements, when I dared to mention them, were met with a polite, vacant nod before the conversation was immediately and expertly steered back to the star of the show. I tried in the beginning to share my world with them. I was genuinely passionate about my work. I once spent months on a pro bono project, helping a small community restore their town's only library, a beautiful but neglected 19th century building. When the project was completed, it was featured in a niche architectural magazine. It was my first major publication, and I was bursting with pride. I brought a copy to Sunday dinner, excitedly showing them the glossy photos and the article that mentioned my name. My mother glanced at the cover, her eyes barely registering the image. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she said, before turning to my brother. "Mark, tell your father about that new suit you bought. Was it Armani or Zegna? It's so important to project the right image." It was 1,000 small cuts, each one carving away a piece of my hope that they would one day see me. The forgotten birthdays because they were on a last-minute trip to Aspen to support Mark through a tough negotiation. The constant, casual comparisons of our incomes, our homes, our lives, always framed in a way that left me feeling wanting. I learned to stop sharing, to build a wall around my professional life. It was easier than facing the quiet, persistent disappointment in their eyes. I poured myself into my work, finding solace and validation in the silent, honest language of wood, stone, and time. My projects became my children, the legacy I was building, one restored cornice, one saved fresco at a time. I held on to a secret, foolish belief that if I just worked hard enough, if I achieved something so significant, so undeniable, that they would finally have to see me. They would have no choice but to be proud. I had no idea that their final, most public insult was about to be delivered on the most important night of my life, an event they knew nothing about. The event that set everything in motion arrived, as it so often did in my family, wrapped in gold paper and tied with a ribbon of praise for my brother. About 2 months ago, my mother called, her voice effervescent with a level of excitement she reserved exclusively for Mark's affairs. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was on site, covered in a fine layer of plaster dust, trying to solve a structural puzzle that had stumped my entire team. "Alex, darling, you must clear your calendar for the 5th of next month. We're having a special dinner at the Gilded Lantern," she announced, the name of the restaurant rolling off her tongue with reverence. The Gilded Lantern was one of the most exclusive, ostentatious restaurants in the city. It was a place for celebrating corporate mergers and political alliances, where the waiters were famously discreet, and the bill for a table of four could rival my monthly mortgage payment. It was entirely my parents' scene, and entirely not mine. I preferred quiet neighborhood bistros with good food and no pretense. "What's the occasion, Mom?" I asked, wiping my hands on a rag as I stepped outside for better reception. I already knew the answer, but I had to go through the motions. "It's for Mark, of course," she chirped, and I could practically hear her beaming through the phone. "He's been made a junior partner at his new firm. We are just so incredibly proud. It's a huge step up, a real validation of his talent, and we want to celebrate it properly. The whole family needs to be there." I felt that familiar, heavy pang in my gut. Mark's new firm was a boutique marketing agency he'd joined 6 months ago after his last venture. A subscription box for artisanal shoelaces went predictably belly up. I happened to know, through a mutual acquaintance in the business world, that the junior partner title was largely ceremonial. It was a clever way for the company to retain him while my parents quietly invested a substantial six-figure sum into the business. It wasn't a promotion he had earned. It was one they had bought for him. Another expensive accessory to maintain the illusion of his success. "That's great news for him," I said, my voice carefully neutral. I tried to inject some enthusiasm, but it felt like trying to start a car with a dead battery. "But Mom, that's a Tuesday night. I'm in the final, critical stages of a major project. I'll be working late all that week, probably through the night." This was the absolute truth. For the past year, I had been consumed by the biggest, most challenging project of my career. It was a restoration so complex and high-profile that it demanded every ounce of my physical and mental energy. It was a confidential project, shrouded in layers of non-disclosure agreements, and the final deadline was looming. I couldn't share the details, not even with my family, a fact that only fueled their narrative that I was toiling away in obscurity on insignificant things. "Don't be difficult, Alex." Her voice cooled instantly, the manufactured warmth evaporating. "This is important. Your brother needs our support. Can't you put your little buildings and your dusty books aside for one evening to celebrate family? We've already booked the private room. It's non-refundable." The familiar emotional cocktail of guilt and frustration settled over me like a heavy blanket. My little buildings, my dusty books. The way she trivialized my entire life's work with such casual disdain still had the power to sting. Arguing was pointless. I knew the script by heart. It would only lead to accusations of jealousy, of selfishness, of not being a team player. "Okay, Mom," I sighed, the dust from the construction site suddenly feeling much heavier on my shoulders. "I'll be there." As the date approached, my sense of dread grew into a palpable anxiety. My parents were in full-blown celebration mode. The family group chat, which I usually kept muted for my own sanity, pinged incessantly with a stream of updates. My mother's couture dress selection, my father's detailed notes on the wine list, photos of a ridiculously expensive watch they'd bought Mark as a congratulatory gift. I was asked, via a brisk text from my mother, to contribute for the gift. When I sent my share, $100 that I had to carefully move from my savings, my mother replied with a simple "K," followed immediately by a gushing message to Mark asking if the watch was to his liking. My initial reaction to the dinner invitation was one of weary resignation, a reluctant acceptance of playing my designated role as the supportive, less successful older brother. But as the event drew closer, I also felt a flicker of something else, a naive, stubborn hope that refused to be extinguished. The project I was finishing was significant, more than significant. It was career-defining. The client was beyond prestigious. Once the project was publicly unveiled, it would be undeniable. Perhaps, I thought, this dinner could be an opportunity. After they had finished their lengthy tribute to Mark, maybe I could finally share my own news. Maybe, for once, the scale of my achievement would be too large for them to ignore. Maybe this time, they would listen. Maybe this time, they would finally be proud. That hope was a fragile, flickering thing, a tiny flame I tried to shield against the relentless winds of past experience. I didn't know then that my family was about to douse that flame with a bucket of ice water, right before it was destined to become a bonfire that would illuminate everything. The stage was being set not for a celebration, but for a confrontation, and I was walking into it completely unprepared for the depths of their disrespect, or for the incredible twist of fate that awaited. The evening of the dinner, I arrived at the Gilded Lantern feeling like a foreigner in a land where I didn't speak the language. The restaurant was a symphony of hushed tones, the gentle clinking of crystal glasses, and the low, confident hum of powerful people making powerful conversation. My parents and Mark were already seated at a prime table in the center of the room, a veritable stage. My mother, draped in shimmering silk, waved me over with a grand, theatrical gesture designed to be seen by the surrounding tables. As I approached, the first of many cuts that evening was delivered with swift, surgical precision. "Alex, finally!" my mother said, her eyes doing a quick, critical scan of my suit. It was a well-tailored navy suit, classic and professional, the best one I owned. "You look neat. I do wish you'd let me take you shopping. Mark has this wonderful tailor downtown who really understands how to dress for success. It's all about the silhouette, you know." Mark, seated beside her, smirked into his old-fashioned. He was wearing a trendy, slim-fit suit in a bold charcoal plaid that probably cost more than my car payment. It was a visible testament to my parents' recent investment in his career. I simply nodded and took my seat, the insult hanging in the air between us like a bad odor. I was not just Alex. I was the before picture, a cautionary tale in tailoring. The dinner began exactly as I expected, a long, fawning tribute to Mark narrated primarily by my father. He recounted, for what must have been the 100th time, the story of Mark's genius business idea in college, an app for rating campus coffee shops that had cost my father $10,000 and never launched. In my father's retelling, it wasn't a failure, but a visionary concept that was simply ahead of its time. My mother gushed about his natural charisma and his unparalleled ability to light up any room. I played my part, the dutiful supporting actor, nodding, smiling, and offering a few bland congratulations when a pause in their monologue seemed to require it. The second cut came when the waiter, a poised professional named Charles, asked about our professions while taking our order. My father puffed out his chest and proudly announced, "My son Mark is a junior partner at a top marketing firm, a real mover and shaker in the digital space." He delivered the line as if he were announcing a royal succession. When Charles turned his polite inquiry to me, I said simply, "I'm a historical architect. I specialize in the restoration of landmark buildings." Before I could elaborate, my father cut in with a dismissive wave of his hand. "He fixes up old buildings. It's very meticulous work." He said the word meticulous as if it were a synonym for boring, unimportant, and pointless. The waiter, to his credit, looked genuinely intrigued. "That sounds fascinating, sir. Any local projects we might know?" "Oh, I doubt it," my mother interjected smoothly, saving me from the crime of having an interesting job. "Now, Charles, Richard was saying the sommelier here is excellent. We'll need a bold Cabernet to celebrate my son's bold future." The conversation was hijacked, and my career was relegated back to the dusty attic of their indifference. I tried, once, to gently pivot the conversation back to a place of shared reality. "Speaking of old buildings, I started hoping to build a bridge from their world to mine. The project I'm just finishing up is actually the most challenging of my—" "Oh, Alex, let's not bore everyone with talk of dust and dry rot," my mother interrupted, patting my hand with a condescending smile. Tonight is about the future. It's about Mark's incredible trajectory. Let's keep things upbeat. That was the third cut, and it was the deepest yet. She hadn't just dismissed my work. She had actively silenced me, framing my passion as a downer, a morbid topic unfit for their celebration. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. I looked across the table at Mark, who was soaking in the adoration like a thirsty sponge. He didn't even bother to acknowledge the casual cruelty of our mother's comment. He simply raised his glass in a silent, self-congratulatory toast. It was then that I attempted my one and only effort at a peaceful, private resolution. Later, while my father and Mark were engrossed in a loud debate about the merits of a Tesla versus a Porsche, I turned to my mother under the cover of their conversation. "Mom," I said in a low, earnest voice, "it really hurts when you dismiss my work like that. It's important to me. It's my entire life, and I would appreciate it if you and Dad could try to show a little more respect for what I do." I had hoped for a flicker of understanding, a quiet apology, anything that suggested she heard me. Instead, she gave me a look of pure, unadulterated pity, as if I were a lost puppy. "Oh, Alex," she sighed, her voice laced with a therapeutic tone one might use on a hysterical child. "You're being far too sensitive. We are proud of you, in our own way. We just know you're not as competitive or as driven as your brother. You don't have that same fire in your belly. And that's okay. Someone has to be the steady, reliable one. We're not disrespecting you. We're just being realistic about your capabilities." Her words were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She had twisted my reasonable request for respect into a confirmation of my supposed weakness. I was too sensitive. I lacked fire. My role in the family was to be steady, a rock for them to stand on while they gazed up in awe at their golden sun. There was nothing more to say. I retreated into a quiet, icy shell for the rest of the meal, picking at my exorbitantly priced sea base and counting the seconds until I could escape. The next day, still smarting from the humiliation, I met my best friend Sarah for lunch. Sarah is a landscape architect, one of the few people who truly understood the passion, precision, and immense pressure my work required. I recounted the events of the dinner in a flat, emotionless tone. When I finished, she put down her fork and looked at me, her expression a mixture of righteous frustration and deep concern. "Alex, why do you keep subjecting yourself to this? This isn't just a case of them favoring your brother. This is a pattern of active emotional abuse. They don't just ignore your success, they intentionally diminish it to make Mark feel bigger. It's like you're the family scapegoat." "They're my family, Sarah," I said weakly, the excuse sounding pathetic even to my own ears. "What am I supposed to do? Cut them off?" "I don't know," she admitted, her voice softening. "But what you're doing now isn't working. You're showing up to these ritual humiliations, holding out this little spark of hope that one day they'll magically see your worth. They won't, Alex. People like that don't change unless they're forced to." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine, her intensity unwavering. "You are one of the most talented, dedicated architects I know. You're working on something huge, I can tell, even if you can't talk about it. When is it going to be enough for you? When are you going to stop waiting for their approval and just own your own spectacular success?" Her words struck a chord deep inside me, a ringing note of truth in a chorus of family lies. She was right. I had been living my life on their terms, forever seeking a validation they were either unwilling or incapable of giving. I had been so focused on the finish line of my secret project, believing its grand unveiling would be the key to their respect. But Sarah's words planted a new, terrifying, and ultimately liberating thought in my mind. What if, Even after my greatest achievement was revealed, it still wasn't enough for them. I was about to find out that the situation was far worse than I imagined, and that the night which I thought had ended was actually far from over. The main course plates were cleared away by a silent, efficient waiter, leaving behind a battlefield of breadcrumbs, butter smears, and wine-stained napkins. A heavy sense of anticipation, thick and cloying, settled over the table. I knew what was coming. It was the centerpiece of the evening, the grand finale my father had been rehearsing in his head all week, the official toast. He stood up slowly, a practiced move of a man who enjoys being the center of attention. He tapped his wine glass with a sterling silver spoon. The crystal rang out, a clear, sharp sound that silenced not just our table, but drew the curious attention of those nearby. "If I could have everyone's attention for a moment," he began, his voice booming with the practiced confidence of a man used to chairing board meetings. He beamed at my brother, a look of almost worshipful pride on his face. "Tonight, we are here to celebrate a truly remarkable milestone. My son Mark has been made a junior partner at his firm. At the tender age of 34, he has proven himself to be a leader, an innovator, and a true American success story." He paused, letting the words hang in the air as he scanned the faces at our table. My mother was gazing at Mark with an expression of pure, unadulterated adoration, as if he had just discovered a cure for a common cold. Mark himself was leaning back in his chair, a smug, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips, accepting the praise as his royal due. My father continued, his speech a carefully curated highlight reel of Mark's embellished achievements. He talked about Mark's vision, his tenacity, and his unwavering drive to disrupt the status quo. Every word was a carefully chosen brick in the monument they had spent a lifetime building to my brother's ego. I steeled myself, expecting the speech to end there. I could handle being ignored. I had 38 years of practice. I was an expert in the art of being the wallpaper in my own family's life. But I was not prepared for what happened next. My father turned his gaze from Mark and, for the first time that evening, looked directly, intentionally, at me. His expression shifted from beaming pride to something more complex, a mixture of paternal disappointment and a strange, condescending pity. It was the look of a gardener examining a plant that had failed to thrive. "You know," he said, his voice taking on a more somber, philosophical tone, "a parent hopes for success for all their children. We all have different paths, of course. Some are destined for the boardroom, for the fast lane," he gestured grandly to Mark, "and some, well, some find their passion in quieter, less ambitious pursuits." A knot of ice formed in the pit of my stomach. The entire restaurant, with its warm lighting and clinking glasses, seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar in my ears. I could feel the eyes of the nearby diners on me now, their polite curiosity shifting to uncomfortable intrigue. This was no longer a celebration. It was becoming a public dissection. "We love both our sons," my father continued, the words feeling like a perfunctory legal disclaimer before the execution. "But we also have to be honest with ourselves and with them. As a parent, you can't help but worry when you see one child soaring to incredible heights, breaking barriers, while the other struggles to get off the ground." He paused, letting the brutal implications sink in. He wasn't just ignoring me anymore. He was actively, cruelly using me as a prop. I was the dark, shabby backdrop against which Mark's brilliant light could shine all the brighter. "Alex," he said, raising his glass directly to me, the candlelight glinting off the rim, "we know you work hard at what you do. We see the hours you put in. But a man's worth, his true worth, is measured by the legacy he builds, by the impact he has on the world. And while your brother is out there building empires and changing the game, you're preserving the past. It's a fine hobby, son, but it's not a legacy. My breath caught in my chest. A hobby. He had just called my life's work, my entire professional identity, a hobby. In a public restaurant, in front of my family and a dozen strangers. Then came the final, devastating, soul-crushing blow. So, as we toast Mark's incredible success, my father concluded, his voice ringing with a terrible finality, we also toast to hope. Hope that Alex, too, will one day find his way, find that fire, and make us just as proud. To Mark, he boomed, his face a mask of parental pride. To Mark, my mother echoed, her eyes shining with actual tears of pride for her golden son. Mark raised his glass, the smug smile now a full-blown grin of triumph as he looked at me over the rim. The world went silent. In that single, horrifying moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't a loud, shattering noise, but a quiet, clean, and final snap. The years of quiet hurt, of being dismissed and diminished, of desperately seeking a crumb of their approval, all of it coalesced into a single clarifying point of white-hot pain. And then, just as quickly as it came, the pain was gone. It was replaced by a strange and liberating calm. I looked at my father's face, flushed with wine and self-importance. I looked at my mother, blissfully oblivious in her bubble of adoration. I looked at my brother, who was basking in the glory of my public humiliation, and I realized, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it was over. The part of me that had craved their validation, that had foolishly believed it was attainable, was gone. He had called me a failure, a disappointment, a man without a legacy. He had done it publicly, with a malice disguised as parental concern. It was the cruelest thing he had ever done to me. And in a strange, twisted way, it was also the greatest gift he had ever given me. Because as I sat there, a ghost at my own execution, surrounded by the wreckage of my illusions about my family, I heard a new set of voices approaching our table. A polite cough, followed by a familiar, authoritative tone that cut through the restaurant's haze. "Pardon the interruption, Richard," a man said. "I hope I'm not intruding on a family moment." My father turned, his face breaking into a sycophantic, almost comical grin as he recognized the newcomer. The entire table stiffened. It was Governor Thompson, the governor of our state, walking towards us with a warm, purposeful smile, flanked by two of his senior aides. And he was looking directly and unmistakably at me. The appearance of Governor David Thompson at our table was like a lightning strike in a quiet, stuffy room. My father, who just moments before had been the swaggering patriarch delivering a verdict on my life, transformed instantly into a fawning, anxious subordinate. He shot up from his chair so quickly he nearly knocked it over, his face a mask of flustered disbelief. "Governor! What an unexpected honor!" I had no idea you frequented the Gilded Lantern," my father stammered, frantically wiping his hand on his linen napkin before extending it eagerly, like a schoolboy hoping to be noticed by the principal. "Richard, Eleanor, good to see you," the governor said politely, giving their hands a brief, perfunctory shake that acknowledged their existence but offered no real warmth. My mother was practically glowing, her mind already racing, no doubt composing the story she would tell her friends at the country club. Mark, for the first time all night, looked slightly less smug and slightly more starstruck, his jaw hanging slightly ajar. But the governor's attention, his entire focus, wasn't on them. His eyes, which were known for being warm but incredibly sharp, found mine across the table. He completely bypassed my father's hovering presence and walked directly to my side, placing a firm, friendly hand on my shoulder. "Alex," he said, his voice filled with a genuine warmth and respect that contrasted so sharply with the cold, condescending pity of my father's toast that it was almost jarring. "I was hoping I'd run into you. I wanted to congratulate you in person. The final sign-off report landed on my desk this afternoon. It's magnificent. Truly. A masterpiece. My family stared, their faces a comical tableau of utter confusion. My father's extended hand slowly, awkwardly, dropped to his side. My mother's frozen, socialite smile began to twitch at the corners. Mark's jaw went from slightly ajar to fully slack. They looked from the governor to me and back again, their brains visibly short-circuiting as they tried to solve an impossible equation. The son they had just publicly declared a failure was being privately praised by the most powerful man in the state. This was my secret. This was my weapon. This was the project I had been pouring my life, my soul, into for the past 18 months. The reason for my late nights, my missed social events, and my tight-lipped responses about work. 2 years ago, the state government had quietly approved a massive, historically sensitive, and politically treacherous restoration of the state capitol building's grand rotunda and original legislative chambers. It was a project of immense historical significance and staggering technical complexity. The original 19th century frescoes were peeling away from the dome. The ornate plasterwork was crumbling into dust, and the grand dome itself was structurally compromised after decades of neglect. It required not just an architect, but a historian, a craftsman, an engineer, and an artist, all rolled into one. My small, specialized firm had been one of dozens to bid on the project. I never truly believed we had a chance against the huge corporate firms from Boston and New York with their armies of lawyers and slick marketing departments. But I had poured everything I had into the proposal, months of painstaking research, my unyielding passion for historical accuracy, and a detailed plan that focused on preservation, not replacement. And, to my own lasting astonishment, I had won the contract. The project was kept under a strict veil of secrecy for both security and political reasons. The governor's office wanted to unveil the finished work as a surprise, a nonpartisan gift to the people of the state, and I was bound by one of the strictest non-disclosure agreements I had ever signed. I couldn't tell anyone, not even Sarah, and certainly not my family, who would have either dismissed it as another one of my little projects or, even worse, tried to leverage my connection to the governor for their own social gain. So I worked in silence, managing a team of the world's best artisans, solving century-old structural puzzles, and painstakingly bringing a state treasure back to life, brick by brick, brushstroke by brushstroke. The governor was the official head of the state's Historical Preservation Committee. He and I had spent countless hours together, poring over original blueprints, debating the precise chemical composition of 19th century mortar, and climbing up rickety, 100-foot-high scaffolding to inspect the work firsthand. He wasn't just a client. He had become a mentor and a genuine admirer of my work. He understood the language of history and legacy in a way my own father never could or would. And now, here he was. The timing was so perfect, so poetically just, that it felt scripted by a divine hand. As I registered the blank, utter shock on my family's faces, a plan began to form in my mind. It was not a plan of vengeance or of anger. It was a plan of quiet, simple truth. I didn't need to say a word. I didn't need to defend myself, raise my voice, or argue my worth. I had spent my entire life trying to make them see me. Now I would simply let them watch as someone else did the job for me. My plan was to do nothing at all. I would become a quiet observer at the public unveiling of my own life's work and my own worth. "Governor, you know my son, Alex?" my father finally asked. His voice strained and thin as he tried desperately to reclaim control of a situation that had spun wildly out of his grasp. "Know him?" The governor laughed, a deep, genuine, and very public sound that turned even more heads in our direction. "Richard. Your son isn't just an architect. He's a state treasure. The man's a bona fide genius. He turned his full attention back to me, effectively shutting my family out of the conversation. Alex, my office is hosting a small private reception right here, in the Bordeaux room, for some of our key legislative partners and the project's primary donors. I'm about to say a few words. I would be deeply honored if you'd allow me to steal you away for a moment. There are some very influential people who are extremely eager to meet the man who saved our capital. He looked from me to my family, then back at me, and I saw a flicker of complete understanding in his eyes. He had undoubtedly overheard the tail end of my father's cruel toast. Governors don't get to that level of power without being masterfully adept at reading a room. He knew exactly what had just happened. "Of course, Governor," I said, my voice steady as I stood up. I felt a strange sense of calm, of almost out-of-body detachment. I was no longer a participant in my family's tired, toxic drama. I was an actor in a much larger play, and my cue had just been called. I glanced at my father, whose face was a raging storm of conflicting emotions, confusion, dawning horror, and a desperate, scrambling attempt to understand how the world had just turned upside down. They had meticulously set the stage for my public humiliation. Instead, they had inadvertently built the grand stage for their own. As I followed Governor Thompson away from the table, I could feel the weight of my family's collective stare on my back. It was a physical pressure, a tangible force composed of disbelief, shame, and a dawning, sickening realization. The governor led me not to a far-off corner, but to a large, circular table just a stone's throw from ours, where about 20 of the state's most powerful people, state senators, influential lobbyists, and prominent philanthropists were gathered. This was no accident. It was a deliberate, strategic move. We were still in the same room, on the same stage. The low murmur of their conversation stopped as we approached. "Everyone," the governor announced, his voice carrying easily through the main dining room, his tone commanding immediate attention. "I'd like you to meet someone very important. This is Alex Miller." A few people nodded politely, their faces a mixture of curiosity and deference to the governor's guest. They knew the governor, but they didn't know me. That was about to change. "For the past 18 months," he continued, placing a hand on my shoulder in a gesture of both support and presentation, "Mr. Miller has been the lead architect and project director for the State Capitol Restoration Initiative. He is the man singularly responsible for the miracle that has taken place within those historic walls." A wave of recognition and impressed murmurs rippled through the room. These were people who understood power, politics, and money. They knew the scale and importance of that project. They knew the political capital it represented, the historical weight it carried, and the sheer amount of money, tens of millions of dollars, that had been invested. They knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the person in charge of it was not some hobbyist who fixed up old buildings. He was a major player. The governor wasn't finished. He gestured for a nearby waiter to bring him a glass of champagne. As one was placed in his hand, he raised it high, not just to the people in his immediate circle, but positioning himself so that his voice, his words, and his line of sight would carry out into the main dining area, directly towards the table where my family sat, frozen like statues in a museum of their own making. "I'm about to give a longer speech in the private room," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "But I wanted to offer a preliminary, more public toast. A toast to a man whose vision, whose unwavering dedication, and whose unparalleled expertise have not only preserved our state's most cherished landmark, but have ensured it will stand for centuries to come. Some people in this world build legacies with spreadsheets and stock trades. Others, the truly great ones, build them with stone, timber, and a profound respect for our shared history. The jab was so subtle, so perfectly aimed, so devastatingly precise, that only a few people in that restaurant would have understood its true target. But I saw my father flinch as if he'd been physically struck. His face went from flushed to pale in a heartbeat. The very words he had used as weapons to belittle me legacy, preserving the past, were now being wielded by one of the most powerful men in the state as the highest form of praise. When we started this project, the governor went on, his voice now filled with a storyteller's passion, we were told by a dozen high-priced firms that it couldn't be done. We were told the water damage to the dome's frescoes was irreversible. We were told the original plasterwork was too delicate to save, the cost too high, the historical details too difficult to replicate. The big, famous firms from New York and Chicago came in with plans to gut the building, to replace our history with a modern, sterile approximation. Alex was the only one who came to us with a plan not just for restoration, but for resurrection. He was the only one who told us we could not only save it, but make it stronger and more beautiful than it had ever been. He didn't just restore a building. He restored a piece of our state's soul. He then turned his full attention to me, his eyes sincere and direct. Alex, on behalf of the 12 million people of this state, thank you. You have given us a gift beyond measure, a legacy for our children and our children's children. He raised his glass higher, his voice ringing with conviction. To Alex Miller! The room erupted in a powerful chorus of "To Alex!" and a wave of sincere, enthusiastic applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the restaurant. Several people immediately came forward to shake my hand, to ask detailed, intelligent questions about the restoration, to express their profound admiration. I was no longer the invisible son, the failed architect, the family disappointment. In the space of 5 short minutes, I had become the man of the hour, the guardian of a legacy. After a few minutes of animated conversation, I excused myself, explaining politely that I needed to return to my family. As I walked the short distance back to the table, the atmosphere around me had completely transformed. The curious, pitying stares from nearby diners had turned into looks of open respect and intrigue. My family, however, looked as if a bomb had gone off directly beneath their breadbasket. My mother's face was ashen, her expensive makeup unable to hide the shock and horror in her eyes. Her celebratory mood had vanished, replaced by a look of utter, dumbfounded bewilderment. Mark, the golden child, had physically shrunk in his chair. His smug, unearned confidence had evaporated completely, leaving behind a pale, sullen young man who suddenly looked very small and very out of his depth. And my father looked utterly devastated. The arrogance, the condescension, the paternalistic pride, it was all gone, replaced by a raw, gaping vulnerability. He was staring at me as if he had never seen me before in his life, as if I were a stranger who had just taken the seat of his disappointing son. I sat down in the deafening, crushing silence. It was my mother who finally broke it, her voice a high, strained, barely audible whisper. Alex, the state capitol building? That was your project? Why on earth didn't you tell us? I was under a non-disclosure agreement, I said calmly, my voice even and steady. It was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. The real reason, the one that now hung unspoken in the air between us, was the one I left unsaid. Because you would have done exactly what you did tonight. You would have diminished it, dismissed it, and somehow, impossibly, found a way to make it about Mark. But the governor, my father stammered, shaking his head as if trying to clear water from his ears. He called you a genius, a state treasure. He seems to have a high opinion of my work, I replied, taking a slow, deliberate sip of water. My hands were perfectly steady. Mark, who had been silent and glowering, suddenly spoke. his voice dripping with a petulant, childish envy. I hadn't heard from him since we were teenagers. So what? You got lucky. You landed one big project. It doesn't change anything. Before I could even think of a response, my father turned on him, his own voice cracking with a strange new emotion I had never heard from him before, shame. "Be quiet, Mark," he snapped, the words like a slap. The conversation, and perhaps our family as we knew it, was over. There was nothing left to say. The truth had been laid bare not by my arguments or accusations, but by irrefutable, undeniable, public validation. I had spent my entire life trying to climb the mountain of their expectations, only to realize I had been on a much higher, more magnificent mountain all along. I carefully placed my napkin on the table and stood up. "If you'll excuse me," I said, my voice quiet but firm, filled with a newfound authority. "I believe the governor is waiting for me. I have some people I need to speak to." I didn't look back as I walked away from the table, away from the wreckage of their arrogance and ignorance, and toward the group of people who saw me not as a failure, but as the architect of a legacy they could all be proud of. For the first time in my entire life, I felt truly, completely, and irrevocably free. Leaving that table was one of the easiest and hardest things I had ever done. Easy, because every fiber of my being screamed for escape from the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of judgment and disbelief. Hard, because it felt like a final, definitive act, a door closing on a relationship, however flawed, that I had spent a lifetime trying to navigate and fix. I didn't return to the governor's private reception immediately. The thought of more socializing, of being the center of attention, was suddenly overwhelming. Instead, my eyes scanned the restaurant and found Sarah at the bar, where she was supposed to be meeting a client. She had seen the entire drama unfold. I saw her initial look of shock as the governor made his speech, followed by a slow, triumphant, almost fierce smile spreading across her face. She raised her glass to me from across the room in a silent, perfect toast. When I reached her, she didn't say a word. She simply stood up, wrapped her arms around me in a tight, grounding hug. "I am so, so proud of you," she whispered into my ear. "Now, let's get out of here before your mother spontaneously combusts." We walked out into the cool, clean night air, leaving the stifling, over-perfumed restaurant behind. The 20-minute drive to my apartment was mostly silent. I was processing the violent whiplash of the evening, from the absolute depths of public humiliation to the dizzying heights of public praise. It felt surreal, like a scene from a movie I was watching instead of living. "You know," I said finally, as we pulled into my driveway and the familiar sight of my quiet building came into view. "The strangest part is, I don't feel angry anymore. I don't even feel triumphant. I just feel empty. Not a bad empty, but a clean empty. Like something incredibly heavy I was carrying for a very long time was just lifted off my shoulders, and I'm still getting used to the lightness." "That's not emptiness, Alex," Sarah said, turning to me, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard lights. "That's peace. It's what happens when you finally stop fighting a battle you were never meant to win. It's the sound of silence after a lifetime of noise." Inside my apartment, my phone, which had been respectfully quiet on my person, started buzzing on the kitchen counter where I'd placed it. The first call was from my mother. I looked at the screen, her name glowing with a false sense of urgency. I took a breath, then silenced the call and put the phone face down on the granite. A minute later, it buzzed again. My father. I silenced that one too. Then a text from Mark, a single, petulant line. "What the hell was that? You need to explain yourself." I didn't owe them an explanation. They had had 38 years to get to know me, to ask about my work, to show even a flicker of genuine interest. They had chosen not to. The information they now so desperately craved had always been available to them. They had simply deemed it, and by extension me, unworthy of their attention. Sarah stayed for a while, and we opened a bottle of wine, a much cheaper and infinitely more satisfying vintage than the one at the restaurant. We talked about the project, finally, and I was able to share the details, the challenges, the triumphs. We talked about the future, about her work, about everything except my family. When she left, I felt a profound sense of calm that settled deep into my bones. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been the background music to my entire life, the anxiety of wondering if I was good enough, of constantly preparing for the next casual dismissal, was gone. The music had stopped. The next morning, the consequences of the previous night began to ripple outward with astonishing speed. The governor's office issued an official press release at 8 a.m. about the successful completion of the Capitol restoration, with my name and my firm's name prominently featured in the headline. The story was immediately picked up by the state's largest newspaper, and by noon, a surprisingly flattering picture of me shaking the governor's hand was on the front page of their website. My phone, which had been buzzing with my family's calls, now began to light up with a different kind of attention. Calls from old colleagues I hadn't heard from in years, from former classmates offering effusive congratulations, and from reporters from both local and national publications. My email inbox, usually filled with contractor bids and zoning regulations, was overflowing with messages of praise and, most surprisingly, lucrative job offers from prestigious firms that wouldn't have given me the time of day a week earlier. Meanwhile, my family was experiencing a different, more personal kind of aftershock. My mother, I later learned from my well-meaning but gossipy Aunt Susan, was mortified. The Gilded Lantern was the epicenter of her carefully constructed social world. The story of Richard Miller toasting his failure of a son just moments before that same son was lauded by the governor spread through their social circle like wildfire. It was the kind of delicious, ironic gossip that high society feeds on. My parents, who had built their entire identities around the projection of success, power, and impeccable judgment, had publicly exposed themselves as clueless, out of touch, and cruel. They tried to reach me for 3 days straight. It was a relentless barrage of calls, texts, and increasingly desperate emails. My mother's messages shifted from demanding an explanation to pleading for me to call her so we can talk this out as a family. My father's went from angry and confused, I don't understand what happened, to something that sounded almost like a grudging apology, though he couldn't quite bring himself to type the words, "I'm sorry" or "I was wrong." I didn't respond to any of them. It wasn't about punishing them, not really. It was about protecting myself. I needed space to process, to adjust to this new, dizzying reality, without their influence, without their inevitable attempts to rewrite the narrative, to minimize their behavior, and to absolve themselves of blame. For the first time in my life, I was setting a boundary, a real one, and the silence it created was more restorative and more powerful than any conversation we could have possibly had. I was starting over, not just in my career, but in my fundamental understanding of myself. I was finally building a foundation of my own, and this time, it was on solid, unshakable ground. 1 year after that fateful dinner at the Gilded Lantern, I stood on the newly restored grand balcony of the state capitol, looking out over the city as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A crisp autumn breeze rustled the architectural plans in my hand, not for a restoration, but for a new building, the city's first sustainable arts and culture center, my first major commission from the ground up. My life was unrecognizable from the one I had been living just 12 short months prior. The success of the Capitol project had been a professional rocket launch. It had catapulted me from a niche specialist into a recognized industry leader. My small firm, once a quiet operation I ran from a modest office, was now one of the most sought-after architectural practices in the state. I had hired 5 new, brilliant architects and 2 project managers just to handle the influx of work. We were now in a position to be selective, choosing projects that had historical or community significance, projects with soul. The financial success was significant, of course, but the real reward was the profound freedom to do the work I loved on my very own terms. The quiet passion my father had so publicly dismissed as a hobby had become the foundation of a thriving, respected, and very profitable enterprise. My personal life had blossomed in tandem with my professional one. Sarah and I had started dating a few months after that night. Our deep friendship, which had always been built on a solid foundation of mutual respect and genuine understanding, had deepened into a quiet, comfortable, and deeply joyful love. With her, I never had to explain my passions or justify my choices. She saw me for who I was and celebrated it without reservation. We were building a life together, one filled with shared dreams, laughter, and quiet weekends spent hiking in the mountains, far away from the noise and judgment of my past. We were in the process of designing our own home, a small, modern house that would be filled with light and books. The justice for my family wasn't a dramatic, cinematic downfall, but a slow, quiet, and painful reckoning with reality. Their social standing, which my mother had prized above all else, took a significant and lasting hit. They became the subject of quiet pity and whispered gossip, the wealthy, successful parents who were so blinded by their own arrogance and favoritism that they had completely missed the brilliance of their own son. They lost the one thing they truly cared about, the flawless illusion of being a perfect, powerful, and impeccably discerning family. The story of the governor's toast became a cautionary tale told at cocktail parties. My father, stripped of his arrogant certainty, became a more subdued, almost hesitant man. The boom in his voice was gone. He tried to apologize to me several times, in his own clumsy way. He'd call and talk about the stock market, and then, in a halting voice, say something like, "That Capitol building, it really is something special. You did good work, Alex." He could never bring himself to address the cruelty of his words that night, but I understood that this was as close to an apology as he was capable of giving. I didn't push him. I knew it was the best he could do. The most profound and difficult change was with Mark. Without my parents' undivided attention and, more importantly, their endless financial backing, much of which was suddenly diverted to charitable donations and other face-saving social maneuvers after their public stumble, his junior partnership began to unravel. The firm, which had happily taken their investment, expected results he simply couldn't deliver. He wasn't a mover and shaker. He was a charming man with mediocre ideas who had been propped up and carried his entire life. About 6 months after the dinner, he was quietly let go during a corporate restructuring. His expensive watch and tailored suits couldn't hide the fundamental lack of substance underneath. He was now working in a mid-level sales job for a regional paper supply company, a position he likely would have held 10 years ago if he hadn't been perpetually carried by our parents. For the first time in his life, he was being forced to stand on his own 2 feet, and he was wobbling badly. I did not cut my family off entirely. To me, that would have felt like a different kind of defeat. The point wasn't to erase them, but to change the terms of our engagement. I established new, firm, and non-negotiable boundaries. We no longer had big, performative family dinners at fancy restaurants. Instead, I would meet my parents for a quiet lunch, once a month, at a neutral neighborhood cafe. Our conversations were different. They started asking questions about my work, listening with a newfound, almost timid respect. They were finally getting to know the son they'd had all along. I even met with Mark a few times, at his request. The smugness was gone. replaced by a sullen resentment that was slowly, painfully, giving way to a grudging, bewildered respect. "I just don't get it," he said once, stirring his beer with a swizzle stick. "You spent all those years just working, not networking, not promoting yourself, just doing the work. How did that end up paying off?" "Because in the end," I told him gently, "substance matters more than style. You can't fake good work forever." It was a hard lesson he was only just beginning to learn. I had offered them a path back into my life, but it was a path predicated on respect, not obligation. They had to meet me where I was, not where they had always expected me to be. Whether they would fully walk that path remained to be seen, but the power dynamic had been permanently and irrevocably altered. They no longer had the power to define my worth. I had taken that power back. My legacy wasn't just in the buildings I was saving or creating. It was in the healthy, joyful, self-respecting life I was now building for myself, far, far away from the long shadow of their expectations. Standing on that balcony, looking out at the city skyline that I now had a hand in shaping, I finally understood the true, quiet nature of success. For 38 years, I had mistakenly believed it was a destination I would reach only when I had finally earned my family's approval. I thought their validation was the prize at the end of a long and frustrating race. I was wrong. The journey of the past year taught me a profound and liberating lesson. Seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you is not a race. It's a cage. You will exhaust your soul trying to fill a cup that they are determined to keep empty. The greatest irony of my life is that my family's most public and cruel attempt to label me a failure was the very thing that finally liberated me from my lifelong need for their approval. Their condescension, meant to put me in my place, actually showed me my place was not with them. Their cruelty severed the final, frayed cord of emotional dependency, forcing me to stand on my own 2 feet and finally, fully and unapologetically own my own worth. I learned that you cannot control how others see you, but you have absolute control over whether you allow their limited vision to become your reality. My father measured a legacy in terms of wealth, status, and power. I've come to understand that a true legacy is measured by the passion you pour into your work, the integrity with which you live your life, and the peace you cultivate within your own heart. It's about building something of substance, something that will stand long after the applause has faded and the critics have gone home. It's about restoring the crumbling foundations within yourself. The relationship with my parents and brother is still a work in progress. It's quiet, it's often awkward, but for the first time, it's honest. By setting firm, clear boundaries, I didn't destroy my family. I gave it the only chance it ever had to become something real, something healthier. We are no longer playing our assigned, suffocating roles. We are just people, flawed and complicated, trying to find a new, more respectful way to connect. Maybe we will get there, and maybe we won't. But either way, I am okay. My happiness is no longer contingent on their approval. It is built on a foundation of my own making, and it is as solid as the stone of the Capitol Dome. So, I want to ask you all a question. Have you ever had to find your own version of success on your own terms, without the support or understanding of those you expected it from most? What did you learn from that experience, and how did you build your own foundation? Share your stories in the comments below. I read them all, and I truly believe your journey can inspire someone else who is feeling invisible right now. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about overcoming challenges and finding your own strength. And don't forget to share this video with anyone in your life who might need a reminder that their worth is not determined by someone else's opinion. Thank you for listening. And remember, the most important project you will ever work on is building a life that is true to you. Don't ever let anyone, no matter who they are, tell you it's just a hobby.